Hi everybody, this is Peter Wilson from Grace Waves Devotional, coming to you from Manchester in the UK, and we're looking at this series, The Authentic Voice of God Through Leadership. Today's part 5, let's go straight into it. An area of great concern in the church today is that of control, manipulation and abuse. Not only by leaders upon church members, but also by church members upon leaders. And let's expose the lie, shall we, that it's always church leaders who abuse their people. I've been a Christian 47 years. I've been in leadership 35 years. And in my experience, it's more the people who abuse leaders rather than leaders who abuse people. But all we hear about is such and such a leader has controlled and abused people. Anyway, I'll leave that with you. So why does abuse and control rise in the church? It's very simple. We haven't learned the principles of boundaries and submission. And as a result, we allow others to walk all over us and treat us like doormats. So let's look at a story from Scripture that will help us understand what boundaries and submission are and what they are not. Okay, and it's 1 Samuel chapter 25, and I encourage you to read the whole chapter when you get time. It's a great story. And let me paint the background of this story for you. It revolves around two people, a married couple called Nabal, he's the man, and Abigail, the woman. And their names mean, Nabal, his name means foolish. He's a fool, okay? Whereas Abigail, her name means father or source of joy. And she was a very wise woman. 1 Samuel 25:3. The name of the man was Nabal, which means fool, and his wife Abigail, source of joy. And she was a woman of wisdom and was beautiful. But Nabal was harsh and evil in his doings. We can see already that Nabal is a bully. He's an abuser. And at this time, David and his men, remember he had 400 men who later became David's mighty men. David and his men were on the run in the wilderness from Saul, who was trying to kill David. And while they were in the wilderness, they protected Nabal's flocks. He had huge flocks of sheep and cattle, etc. He was a big businessman. And they protected his flocks from bears, wolves, predators, thieves, etc. So Nabal lost none of his cattle. And there came a feast day. And David said to his men, we've looked after Nabal's flocks. Go and see him for me on my behalf and ask him if he will give us half a dozen sheep so we can enjoy this feast day. So David's young men pitch up at Nabal's front door, and when they ask him on behalf of David for these sheep, his bullying, abusive character kicks in and says, and he told them to sling their hook in no uncertain terms, that they were getting nothing from him. You see, as his name says, foolish. He's a fool. And foolish is as foolish does. And we can all make foolish decisions and take foolish actions, but there are some people whose overall behavior is that of a fool continually. So how can we discern when someone is a fool? Proverbs 27:22 says, though you grind a fool in a mortar with a pestle, along with crushed grain, yet their foolishness will not depart from them. Just excuse me while I get a pestle and mortar. Isn't it great on YouTube that you can do anything? You don't have to stand on ceremony. Here is a pestle and mortar. Can you see this? You put spices in there and you crush them into powder. And look at the end of the pestle, how big and weighty it is. So it says there, even though you grind a fool in a mortar with a pestle, along with crushed grain, yet their foolishness will not depart from them. It's as if they get whacked round the back of the head for their foolish behaviour, and when they wake up they go, oh, I must do that again. And fools repeat the same foolish behaviour again and again. That's how you can tell a fool. A fool is also someone who cannot be reasoned with. Nabal could not be reasoned with. He showed that the moment David's men asked him for some sheep. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in their own eyes, but they who heed counsel are wise. Nabal thought he was always right in his own eyes. It's arrogance and pride. And let me tell you, both men and women can be fools. You can have a man who's dressed in a very smart suit, has a great job, but he can be a fool. How can you tell? He will repeat the same behaviour again and again, and he'll be a man who can't be reasoned with. A woman may be very attractive, wear very modern clothes and very stylish, but she can be a fool. Being a fool is not about social status, folks. It's just who you are. Who you are. And even the servants of Nabal's household knew what he was like, that he was a man who couldn't be reasoned with. Why? What happened? When David heard the news of the way Nabal had spoken to his men, anger rose up within him and overtook him. And he said, everyone strap on their sword, and God do so to me and more also, if by this time tomorrow all of Nabal's household are not dead. Actually, let me tell you that in the Hebrew it doesn't say that. It says this: God do so to me and more also, if by this time tomorrow there's not one man of Nabal's family left who can piss against the wall. You know, the Bible is not all pretty. It can be very crude, and that's what it says in the Hebrew. But the translators have covered that over and used other words to pretty it up. But you see, David had lost it. He'd made a decision out of strong emotions, and I'm telling you, it was the wrong decision. And when we make decision out of emotions, it's always the wrong decision, folks. Because emotions cloud our mind. They cloud our sense of being able to see things in reality. And the best thing to do is leave it for 24 hours. Most problems will wait for 24 hours. That gives time for your emotions to calm down. It's like the sand on the seabed that gets stirred up and promotes this kind of a foggy sand. It takes time, doesn't it, for that sand to settle once again. And if you leave it 24 hours, gives you time to pray about it, time to think the circumstances through, time to make the right decision. And invariably, if you do it that way, you will make the right decision and save yourselves a lot of pain, because you couldn't wait. You had to mouth off, and it was the wrong thing. So now the servants of Nabal, they've heard that David is out to kill them all. And in 1 Samuel 25:17, one of the servants comes to Abigail secretly and says to her, now know and consider what you will do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel that he cannot be reasoned with. Can you see? Even the servants knew what Nabal was like. And when Abigail heard about the trouble that Nabal had caused, let's be honest, folks, she'd heard it many times before, because Nabal had repeated this kind of behavior again and again. What did Abigail do? She didn't go to Nabal, but she conjured up a plan to save the family. Let me explain what the plan was. She ordered the servants to load up 6 donkeys with food, wine, drink, you name it, everything that the men needed in the wilderness. And she set off to meet with David. But before I get into that, let me just say this. What was Abigail doing here when she wouldn't go to Nabal to tell him her plan? She was putting a boundary in place to protect herself. Why? Because Nabal could not be reasoned with. She knew if she went to see him, he would bully her and probably talk her out of the plan. So instead of going to see him, she did it behind his back. And you say, surely that's not biblical. Isn't the wife supposed to submit to her husband? Well, let's look at this whole thing of submission. Whether it's a wife to a husband, a child to a parent, a worker to their boss, or a church member to a church leader. Throughout the Bible, the truth of submission is that we are only called to submit to righteous authority. And righteous authority is legitimate authority. But if we are asked to submit to unrighteous authority, then we're to say no and put a boundary in, because unrighteous authority is illegitimate authority. And Abigail knew that Nabal could not rule his household with righteous authority. He was a bully. He was abusive. Therefore, she put a boundary in to protect herself from him and never went to share her plan with him because she knew she'd get no truck from him. So she took matters into her own hands. I love this story of what Abigail did. You see, what is unrighteous authority that we can say no to? Number one, if we are asked to sin. And number two, if we are asked to do something that is against our conscience. So if I'm serving in the church and the church leader says to me, Pete, go and stand in the middle of the road until a car knocks you over. I'm not going to do it, am I? Because that is sin. And I will say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm trying to give you simple illustrations. No, I will not do that. I'm putting a boundary in. Can you see? Or if a leader asks me to do something that's against my conscience, Pete, I'm in the office today, but if anybody rings up, tell them I'm out. You see, that would be against my conscience. And I would say, no, I'm not going to tell them that because that's lying and I'm not going to lie for you. Can you see? It's against my conscience. But here's the thing. Other than those two things, sin and your conscience, I'm talking in the church now. Whatever a church leader asks you to do, you should be able to do it. We have this weird idea of servanthood today that we will serve in the church as long as somebody asks us, as long as nobody asks us to do something we don't like or we don't want to do, and then we say no and we dig our heels in. That's not servanthood, folks. If a leader says to you, Pete, I don't want you to paint the door red, I want you to paint it black, then your servanthood spirit should immediately kick in and say, yes, sir, I'll do that. If you're the leader, if that's what you want, I will do it. Mick Jagger, the Rolling Stones, I see a red door and I want it painted black. But if we dig our heels in and say, no, I think it should be red, can you see what's happening there? You've got a wicked wisdom, demonic wisdom that will bring disunity and break down relationships. So it's very simple about putting a boundary in, folks. We submit to righteous authority. We don't submit to unrighteous authority. And the reason so many Christians have allowed themselves to be controlled and abused is because they don't know anything about boundaries. I've counselled and mentored a lot of believers across the world. Remember, I've been a Christian for 47 years. And few of those people had any understanding of boundaries. So let's just look at this, because it's so important. This is why families have so many bust-ups, why marriages bust up, why churches bust up, simply because people don't know how to put boundaries in to protect themselves. So let's look at it. God made each person a free will being responsible for their own words and actions. And we always want to cry foul when a leader abuses people. But seen in the light of being a free will person and being accountable for myself, if I am abused, it's my fault, not the leader's fault. Can you see that? I've allowed that leader to abuse me when I should have put a boundary in. And we don't like hearing words like this, because we want our pound of flesh. I've been abused. See, no, if you're going to change, you've got to realise you allowed that abuse to take place, and you need to learn to put boundaries in. So I should have put a boundary in place to protect myself, and I didn't. Therefore, I allowed myself to be abused, controlled, and manipulated. And all of us are susceptible to being controlled and abused, because we all have a naive innocence that wants to believe that leaders, or anyone else for that matter, always have our best interests at heart. But the truth is, even the best of us can end up controlling and abusing others. It's just part of the old flesh thing, folks. And so there are two reasons why we put a boundary in place. Number one, to protect ourselves from being controlled and abused. And number two, a boundary forces the other dysfunctional person to take responsibility for their behaviour. So I'm just trying to think of an example off the top of my head. A man's married, he's got 2 kids, he's got a very important job, he works in an office, and he's supposed to be home every night for his evening meal at 6 o'clock. But it gets into this thing where he's never home. So he comes home late. His wife has to then get his meal ready and give it to him. So she's being abused. So she says to him, look, we made this deal. You would be home at such and such a time for the evening meal, and you've not been doing it. So here she puts a boundary in now. From now on, if you're not home, your meal will be in the kitchen. I will not be putting it in the microwave for you. You'll have to do it yourself, and you can eat alone. See what she's doing? She's forcing her husband, hopefully, to take accountability for his dysfunctional behaviour. And you can apply that across every spectrum, folks. Now, I realise there are times where men badly abuse their wives physically, and apparently there are 2 women a week in the UK who are murdered by their husbands. Wow, you can't even get your head around that, can you? And those women need further help, I understand that. But in most everyday situations, you can learn to put boundaries in. And I've done a whole series of boundaries that if you'll go onto my YouTube channel, you will find them there. And it will explain step by step how to put boundaries in. And you know, sometimes boundaries have to be stronger than at other times. Remember I think it was last week, we looked at this story of Jesus and Peter, Matthew 16, verses 21 to 23. Excuse me. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an offence to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. See, both Peter and Jesus got in one another's faces in this story with very strong words. So with Peter, it is, Far be it that you should go up to Jerusalem. Jesus, see, in this instance, Peter was the controller and manipulator. Even though he meant well, his abusive character came out. His strong personality could have overwhelmed Jesus and flattened Jesus. But Jesus was made of sterner stuff and got right back in Peter's face. Get behind me, Satan. You know, you are an offence to me. And pulled Peter up. And Peter realised he was in the wrong. You see, when we know that we are a free will being, responsible for our own decisions and actions, and when we know when someone transgresses our personal boundaries, we can be very strong in putting a boundary in place. Because at the end of the day, we have to protect ourselves. And sometimes we may put that boundary in out of intense anger, which is not the right way to do it. Nonetheless, you should do it. The reason the intense anger is there is because we've not been used to putting boundaries in, and the anger has built up until it comes out in a mad fury. But when you start to put boundaries in when you should, you'll find that you can do it without anger, and it is very powerful, folks. I had an illustration there the other week. Someone in church said something to me that was attacking my character. Immediately I put a boundary and said to that person, do not say that to me again. You are not attacking my character. Do not say it again. And they had to back away. You see, we've got to stop being victims and also stop assisting people to be victims when it comes to boundaries. See, when someone's been abused by another person and we say, there, let me put my arm around, oh, cry on my shoulder. That nasty person has abused you and used you and should be severely dealt with. Well, that's okay to say that. But what we should be telling that person is how they've allowed themselves to be controlled and abused, and that they need to change and learn how to put boundaries in place so it doesn't happen again. You know, not long ago, I preached at a Christian retreat conference about family relationships and how we can abuse each other. And at the end, we invited people to come forward for prayer. And every person I prayed for had a boundary issue. That is, they had been abused by a family member and couldn't understand why this family member would treat them so bad. And when I explained to them about putting boundaries in place to protect themselves, it was as if they didn't want to know. They just wanted to wallow in their self-pity, and they didn't want to know about boundaries. You know why? Because once they knew about it, they would be responsible for putting those boundaries in and standing up to that family member, and they didn't want to hear it. They'd rather remain a victim. See, that's cowardly behaviour, folks. Do you know that? Fear of facing up to someone is cowardly behaviour. Their naivety was off the charts and they didn't want to know. You know, folks, we can all have times of self-pity, but if we're going to grow in grace, we have to face up to the changes that need to be made in order to protect ourselves from being used and abused. Otherwise, the cycle of abuse will just continue. And here's the thing, folks. If you know you should be putting boundaries in and you don't put them in, and you keep being abused and you blame the other person, that is sin, because it's not their fault, it's yours. You're not taking personal accountability for yourself. It's your fault, not the abuser's fault. We don't like hearing those words, but that's the truth. And we have to look here at the two kinds of wisdom. James 3 verses 13 to 17. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show by good conduct that their works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. Where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, or willing to be reasoned with, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. So when we look at this wisdom and we apply it to Nabal, we see that Nabal had demonic wisdom. James 3:14 and 16. If you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. And where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Nabal was a self-seeker. He only thought of himself. That's called pride and arrogance. This is why Nabal couldn't be reasoned with. His pride had made his head so big, he could only see himself. Whereas Abigail, she had godly wisdom, the wisdom from above. James 3:17. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, willing to be reasoned with, full of mercy and good fruits, and without partiality and without hypocrisy. So, excuse me a second. Thank you. What is the wisdom from above? Christ is the wisdom from above. It was Christ who came down to earth to rescue mankind. Colossians 2 verses 2 and 3. To the knowledge of the mystery of Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Christ is the wisdom from above, and he lives in our hearts. And as James 3:17 says, Christ is pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And Abigail had the Christ wisdom from above. So let's look at how she enacted her plan with David. She loaded up 6 donkeys with food and drink, etc. And she met David as he was halfway towards Nabal's home. The first thing she did was get off a donkey, get down on her face before David. Humility. And she said, David, I know you're angry, but let your anger fall on me rather than my household. See, sacrifice. She was willing to sacrifice her own life for her family and the workers in Nabal's business. And then she did a great thing. This is how wise she was. She knew that if David killed any of her household out of wartime, David would have blood on his hands and a guilty conscience. And she knew David would soon be the king. And so in Israel, the only time you could kill was in a time of war. Outside of war, if you killed, you were guilty. You had blood on your hands. So she reminded David of all of this, and it cooled David's heels. And he realized she was a woman of wisdom, and he eulogized Abigail for her wisdom. See, although David was angry, he was a man who could be reasoned with and could receive wisdom. And so Abigail prevented David from carrying out his threat. And when Abigail returned home, she waited for a while because Nabal was celebrating the feast day and he was drunk. And when he'd sobered up, she told him how close he'd become to losing his life. And the shock of it caused him to have a heart attack, and he died 10 days later. And the moment David heard that Nabal had died, he sent his men to Abigail and said, "Will you marry me?" Because not only was she beautiful, but she had this great wisdom, and David was open to the wisdom of other people. Can you see? So we'll leave it there for today, folks, and I shall see you hopefully next week. Have a great day. Bye-bye.